Welcome, good afternoon. I'm Bronwyn Maddox. I'm the new director of the Institute for Government, and I'm delighted to be here at what is the first event of the Institutes that I'm chairing. Actually, I realise, having said that, it's not actually the first. There was one on Pakistani government some time ago, but the first while I'm here. As I've said to many of you, and many of you have made the point to me in very friendly, welcoming emails, it couldn't be a more interesting time to be here. The question we've got today is one of the most interesting legacies, speaks to one of the most interesting legacies of this very lively summer we've had. Has the public really had enough of experts? Can I thank in that the Royal Statistical Society and the Carnegie UK Trust for being our partners in this. And we've got a fantastic panel here to discuss this, and I know already there's going to be an awful lot of questions. So let me start with just introducing the panel, and before I just set out the kind of things that we're going to be talking about. Deborah Mattinson is the founding director of Britain Thinks, or one of the co-founder of it, and was also pollster to Gordon Brown, and is one of the UK's leading commentators on public opinion. Etan Shah is the executive director of the Royal Statistical Society, and also a senior research fellow at the King's Policy Institute and a non-executive director of the Higher Education Statistics Agency. Has the most impressive lot of speaking notes, absolutely relevant. Do show everyone. Yes. Yeah. One of our online graphics. Oliver Wright is a policy editor at the Times newspaper, where he's also been news editor and reporter, and been political editor at The Independent. And Will Moy, director of Full Fact, the UK's only independent fact-checking organisation, as it calls itself, which checks claims made by politicians and interest groups. Well, look, we're delighted to have you all here as audience and the panel. And we obviously were prompted by Michael Gove's comment in the middle of the referendum campaign that the public have had enough of experts. Both sides promptly jumped on this and challenged it, but there has been a lot of comment in this summer, particularly with the American election boiling up, about whether we're in a post-truth age, whether it doesn't matter in some contexts whether a candidate says something if he or she says it with enough passion, whether people are after passion, not facts, or whether in a more nuanced way, maybe they're still interested in facts, but only the ones that support their side of the argument. Well, there's a lot to say about all this, so let's plunge straight in. I'm going to start in this with Etan. Your thoughts.
Great, thank you very much. So my first point would be that the referendum's a special case and we mustn't overgeneralise from it. So it's an odd situation where we were asked a very kind of specific question, but it was actually a very general question. So do you want to be in the EU or out? And out wasn't very clearly specified. I'm not saying that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it then meant that it's quite difficult to know what you're talking about. There were lots of things debated: immigration, sovereignty, economy, etc., etc. So it was a bit different from the AV referendum as well. So I think we mustn't overgeneralise from that scenario to everyday policy making, as it were. So that would be my first point. Second point, I think, is that the polling shows us that public trust in experts remains high. So if you look at the Ipsos polling around experts in telling the truth, doctors, we think 89% of us think that doctors tell the truth, 86% of us think teachers do, judges 80%, scientists 79%. So these remain high and have been high for quite a long time. And I think Nat Sen's research on statistics is interesting. I would say that. I run the Royal Statistical Society. They said 68% of people trust the ONS. Now what's interesting is if you ask them, do politicians use official statistics accurately when talking about their policies, 69% of people say no. So they've got a sophisticated understanding. The body that produces the stats tells the truth, but politicians then don't use them very well. I think that's a sophisticated understanding. Third point is the role of the media. So Jill Matheson, who's a fellow of the RSS, over the summer did a review of the BBC's use of statistics in general. One of the points that came across is the false balance. And so you wouldn't have known that there was near unanimity from economists that Brexit was not good for us from an economic perspective. There may be other arguments for Brexit, but that wasn't necessarily a good one. But you couldn't necessarily tell that because the BBC would field one person for and one person against. So this issue of false balance in the media, I think, is a real issue and comes across in other everyday policy matters as well. So that is something that we need to look at. Fourth point is around the role of the statistics profession. Now, one issue, I think, is that the statistics profession, the ONS in particular, were not prepared enough thinking about what are the obvious issues that are going to come up. It was pretty obvious that migration was going to be an issue, pretty obvious our contribution to the EU was going to be an issue, and they should have perfected the figures on this in advance so that there wasn't a dispute by the time we got into the heat of the campaign, but they didn't. Similarly, the UK Statistics Authority, which is the body that beats up politicians when they get it wrong, it did intervene around the £350 million figure and a couple of other things, but it didn't do it strongly enough. We can see that in retrospect because Ipsos Mori tells us almost a majority of people still believed in that figure by the time of the referendum. So I think the statistics bodies could be more active in this area. Final point is around the whole question of facts in a polarized environment. There's new research from Sunstein, who was one of the authors of the Nudge book that's very famous, showing that, for example, with climate change, if you give people the facts, if they already hold strong views, it actually just embeds their view even more. So where people have strong views, actually the role of facts is quite problematic in some ways, and we've got to think through quite hard therefore how facts and evidence can play out. And Bronwyn was talking about a post-truth society. You know, it seems to be we're increasingly in a populist politics. You see the rise of Trump, of Farage, of Le Pen. There is a danger there, offering simplistic solutions to complex problems, which is for me the definition of populism. And the question is, I think, for us as a community, what is underlying that? Because as somebody said in the US election, you're bringing facts to a culture war, and I think that there's a real problem there for us. So I found it very interesting, McKinsey's research, which was brought out 2 or 3 months ago, showing that 65 to 70% of households in 25 rich countries hadn't in the last decade seen really any increase in wages. Whereas if you look at 2005 to if you look at the preceding period, 93 to 2005, that was only true for 2% of households. So I think that there is a question there about how far is this driven by wages, how far is this driven by other issues. This is the sort of thing that we as an elite, as a set of experts need to grapple with. A final point is, the dream is you have a society where you have democratic debate, where the public can handle uncertainty, and that we as experts, scientists, statisticians, economists, can share the fact that not everything, knowledge is incomplete, is contested. You look at the discussion about statins in the news this week, there's new evidence which has overturned the old evidence. And it's only when we can have an education system that allows people to really understand uncertainty, probability, I think that's got to be the long-term response to this issue. Thank you.
Thanks, that's tremendous and a lot there to come back to. I love this phrase of bringing facts to the cultural wars, if you like, and you were flicking at the end on how new this is and what's driving it, if indeed we're looking at a new mood. We'll come back to that. Deborah.
Yeah, I was asked to answer 3 questions, and I will dutifully do that in a minute, but I do just want to pick up on something that you said. Actually, I disagree. I don't think the referendum was a special case. I mean, obviously it had some unique features as an electoral contest, but I think that what it did was to highlight a lot of issues that had been big, strong features in public opinion, in the way that we do business with politicians as the public. I don't think there was anything very special about that. I think it performed in much the same way that those sorts of contests do. Anyway, be that as it may, we can come back to that. That's we can debate that. So the first question I was asked to answer was this: why did facts and analysis fail to cut through in the referendum? And I read this several times. The thing is, they did cut through. Facts and analysis did cut through. The problem is that we don't all agree about what are the right facts and what are the facts and analysis that we should be listening to. And that's where the disconnect is between, different groups of the public, between the public and the elite, between experts and everyone else. So, doing focus groups a lot through that campaign, I found one fact in particular was very clearly remembered and quoted back a lot, and you know what this is. Of course, I'm about to tell you, it was the £350 million a week. Everybody knew that fact. I mean, that was an astonishingly successful piece of communication. And also what happened was that, and the poll showed this very clearly, that the Leave campaign was more trusted than the Remain campaign to tell the truth. nearly 40% trusted Leave, whereas only 24% trusted Remain. Also, Boris was more trusted than Cameron, 45 playing 21. So some quite big differences. And in terms of what was cutting through to people, people also very clearly understood that leaving the EU might be bad for the economy. They got that. They're not idiots. They knew that. The problem was that they didn't connect that to their own finances. And there was one wonderful quote that summed this up in a focus group, the woman saying, I know it's bad for the economy, but it's not bad for my economy. That connection simply hadn't been made. But they did feel that it would make a big difference to immigration and that would have an impact on their lives. And what they felt about experts, I think, is quite interesting, because they felt that experts were in fact not necessarily experts, but spokespeople with a particular vested interest. So the fury, for example, when Obama spoke out, and actually when Carney spoke out too, that I got fed back in focus groups, it's like they are just vested interests. They are talking up the thing that matters to them, but it's not the thing that matters to me. They did think that those people were sincere. They thought they had plenty of expertise, but they didn't think, the public, that they were speaking to their agenda. And in the end, they saw the results, a lot of people, particularly people who voted Leave, as the triumph of the little guy over the powerful. And I was doing focus groups last week. A guy in Harlow said to me, when I woke up the next day and realised that we'd gone Brexit, I felt like England had won the World Cup. And he described how he sort of like got out of bed and leapt round the room and sort of punched the air. And the thing is, that kind of optimistic feeling is not just about people who voted Leave now. So all the stuff about should we have another referendum, and people keep saying to me, have the Leave people kind of realised yet? You know, have they changed? Have they realised a terrible mistake? Well, no. Actually, more than 6 out of 10 of us feel quite optimistic about the future post-Brexit. So, and that obviously therefore includes quite a lot of people who voted Remain, who are kind of going along with it. So that's the first question. The second question I was asked to answer was, what does this mean for other policy debates, e.g. immigration and NHS funding? And I would say, I think this is where it highlights something that's been going on for a long time. So the immigration arguments used by most politicians had not been working for a very long time. Well, actually, for quite a long time, they weren't even making the arguments. So the public would say, we're worried about immigration. But there was a feeling that you couldn't speak out, that you know, somebody in a focus group would say, I'm not being funny or anything, but you know, I do feel a bit worried about this. And then somebody else would say, well, yeah, well, I do as well. And there'd become a kind of consensus in the room that meant it was okay to talk about it. But actually, at that point, politicians didn't even talk about it. Then they started saying, yes, I get it. They started talking about it, but they still didn't do anything about it. I do think that one thing that's happened, and it's been coming a while, but I think it has happened post the referendum, is suddenly there is a license to speak these truths, and people are almost defiant about it, and again, actually focus groups last week, the women were just chatting to each other at the end of the focus group as they were packing their bags up to leave, and one of them said to the rest, yeah, my husband's a racist. And she said it like, you know, yeah, my husband's a Chelsea supporter. You know, it was sort of, and they were like, oh yeah, is he? They said, yeah, not about everyone, it's just the Muslims. Like, oh yeah, the Muslims, yeah. So it's become okay. It's now top of people's wish list for what will happen post-Brexit. And there is already concern that Theresa May's kind of, you know, softly approach is not going to cut the mustard, that actually maybe she's holding back. What people are very clear is that they do want something done here, and they are very disappointed if it doesn't happen. And, you know, the majority of people are now saying, if something big doesn't happen about immigration as a result of this, I will feel very, very let down. Final thing, what does this mean, I was asked, for politicians, policy makers and decisions? And actually, to your point, I agree with what you said about some experts are trusted, but not all experts are trusted, so doctors, sure. But actually, I don't think we've ever seen a bigger disconnect between the public and politicians. And when, in some focus groups we were doing for some work that we're doing with the Resolution Foundation, which launches next week, I asked people to write down the first word that came into their head when they thought about Britain nowadays, and almost everybody chose a word like divided, fractured, broken. There is this sense that we are not cohesive as a society, that something has gone wrong. And there's within that a very, very powerful story about haves and have-nots. And the really interesting thing about this is that the people who think they are have-nots are not necessarily the people we would all think are have-nots. But they feel that very powerfully. It's, you know, there's a very powerful sense of unfairness. What was interesting, I tested as part of this Theresa May's speech on the steps of Downing Street. Actually, it pressed all the right buttons. It was fantastic. But their comments are kind of laced with cynicism. Yeah, you know, let's see her now walk the walk, and they're waiting to see. And as I say, the sense of a slow, measured approach to dealing with Brexit is not what they're wanting to hear. Grammar schools also, just as a point of interest, not the right policy focus.
We're beginning to
sure.
Yeah,
okay, literally, I'm on my last point. I was just going to say all of this is made much worse by the feeling that people have that there is no opposition and the government can do whatever it wants.
Thanks very much indeed. You forgive me saying we're beginning to stray
no,
the political agenda at the, at the end, but terrific amount there. I'm going to come back to you on your point in parentheses when you said doctors, sure, and we might come on to actually
yes.
people's views of medicine.
Sure, journalists are trusted as experts. But speaking as a journalist, I mean, I care a huge amount about, firstly, about experts and secondly, about facts, even if, you know, to a lot of you, our profession in general might be seen not to. But I would say, the referendum aside, I think journalism has got a lot better over the last decade in the way in which it treats experts and the way in which it treats facts, particularly in areas of science and medicine. Organisations like Full Fact, when they started off, were a complete culture shock to newsrooms across the country, because I think you probably admit this, he took quite a militant attitude. If we got something wrong, we would get a complaint, and that complaint would then go to the PCC, as there was then, if it wasn't properly resolved. And at first journalists say, who are these people? Why are they questioning it? But actually, over the long run, it's made us all think a little bit harder that when we get a press release from organisations to pick at random, like the Taxpayers Alliance, perhaps we need to be a little bit careful without taking their facts for granted. Another very good organisation, rather than facts about experts, is a group called the Science Media Centre, which started up around 10 or 15 years ago now. They were very worried, really out of the backdrop of the BSE crisis and various health scares of one description and the other, that a lot of what was being reported in the press wasn't accurate, and they thought to themselves, well, how can we address this? So they worked with the science community to get a panel of experts for every different subject. They didn't have a sort of set board or something, but if there was a story that was in the news, they would assemble a panel of experts. They would invite journalists along, and they could question them. They didn't, you know, it was short speeches, and then they could ask any questions they liked. And I think that over time has done a huge amount to improve the sort of understanding of journalists, particularly in the health and science remit. Equally, organisations like Sense About Science have done a very similar sort of thing, and I think that has fed through. One point on the referendum and Michael Gove, I just think it's curious and worth making the point. He, of course, used to be a journalist, and he was my boss, one of my first bosses. Actually, I think he's one of the politicians who believes most in experts, apart from a few small ideological sort of eccentricities that he's got. You know, both in education and in justice. He spent a huge amount of time reading the literature, talking to people, and actually trying to set about making evidence-based policy. But I think, finally, we ought to be careful of experts for two reasons. And the first example I would give is the MMR scandal, which I was involved in writing about and reporting. We must always remember that it was experts that created the MMR scandal and experts that debunked it. And, you know, we do, just because someone who's a professor in front of their name or a string of initials after it, we should always question it and not be sort of blown over and sort of made to think that this must be true because some eminent person is saying it. And perhaps in terms of the referendum campaign, we also need to be careful not to be blinded by groupthink. Often experts talk to each other at conferences and symposiums, and people who think something slightly different are made to sort of move into the general stream. And I think, Deborah, I'd be interested in your view of this on pollsters as well. One of the theories around the election was that no pollsters wanted to be the outlier, and so there was a sort of groupthink. So yes, we should listen to experts, yes, we should care about facts, but we should do none of them unquestioningly.
Thank you very much indeed. A lot of that rings true with me. We'll explore. Every journalist is familiar with the kind of retort that goes something like, "You got your facts wrong, the fact is I'm right." Which,
Thank you very much. I should say that Full Fact is concerned with the whole wider debate here about how we have an informed public debate, and Ollie mentioned another part of our work, which is the corrections work. But we do a lot of work with expert organisations too about how they can communicate more effectively in the debate, and that's where obviously we'll focus today. And I'd like to start by making two observations about the referendum. One is that there was huge demand for reliable, trusted information from the general public. Absolutely huge. Demand for our work spiked, demand for our work from the media spiked. The breadth of media that wanted to work with us was far broader than it ever has been before. The other is that some experts did outstanding work trying to connect with the public, and I pay particular tribute to the UK and a Changing Europe group, who had academics traipsing up and down the country doing town hall meetings, answering people's questions. And the commitment they showed to genuinely engaging with the public is something that I think we should all respect. Deborah, am I right to say that the single most trusted person on the referendum question was Martin Lewis?
Yes.
Yes. Martin Lewis, otherwise known as money-saving expert, the counterexample to Michael Gove's assertion. It's not that people are sick of experts, it's that people are selective about experts. People won't simply take your word for it because you have credentials. People place trust, and they place trust based on a decision about whether you're worth trusting. And Martin Lewis is a very interesting example there. He is credible. He knows what he's talking about, and nobody really doubts that. He is authentic. You know what he stands for. And he is identifiable. You know who he is. Credible, authentic, identifiable. If you cast your mind around the experts in the policy world, economists or topic experts, how many of them actually pass that test? Have we already whittled it down to just the Institute for Fiscal Studies? So we've got that test already. But then Martin Lewis is also somebody who engages with you as an individual and how things will affect your life and helping you make up your own mind. That's what he's there for. It's very easy to think of Martin Lewis as somebody who is on your side. How many policy experts would you say that so unhesitatingly about? One of the interesting things about Martin Lewis, actually, he did a big blog when he came out in the referendum and decided to take a side in the referendum. And before he did, he came to us and he said, "Will you fact check it before I publish it?" And he was very keen to make sure that he got his facts straight, and he was very keen to be able to show that he had gone through that process. This is a man who knows more about building trust in this century than anyone else in the country. 8 million of us get his emails every week, and 8 million of us buy the things he tells us to buy. So what can policy people learn from that? Well, one of the things I'd observe about Martin Lewis is that when he decided to intervene in the referendum campaign, and you could think that Martin Lewis is on your side, he wasn't spending political capital that he hadn't earned in advance. You could say, you know, you trusted Martin Lewis long before the referendum, you will trust him long after. He didn't just pop up in the middle and ask you to take his word for things. If you haven't earned your political capital in advance, you simply cannot spend it. And we can observe that academic capital simply does not transfer into political capital. Simply having a PhD is not enough to have your word taken. And there are lots of reasons for that. One of the reasons is experts get things wrong. One of the reasons is that experts, I think, are sometimes prone to exaggerating what falls within the sphere of expertise and what is then a matter of judgment, and then what after that is purely a matter of opinion. And there aren't actually enough people who do a good job of defining the line between those different categories and deferring where they should defer to the public to make our own minds up. There's a third reason I'd like to flag briefly and refer you to Andy Haldane's brilliant recent speech on the subject for more, which is that by and large the expert conversation is very naturally often conducted in terms of averages and aggregates. And people's lives aren't. So if you take immigration, the most potent issue of a referendum campaign, if you went on TV or the radio, as I often did, and you were asked, you know, what's the effect of immigration on the economy? The short version is something like, well, there's lots of studies and they don't all agree, but most of them agree that the effect on public finances is relatively small and it's probably slightly positive. But of course, that's not necessarily the effect on you. The effect on jobs and wages varies depending who you are. If you're well off, you're probably a winner. If you're less well off, you might well lose out. Now, very often, actually, in interviews, what you get is only the top half, the average picture. On aggregate, immigration is good for the economy. I'm an expert, listen to me. Fine, but if your personal experience is, on average, in my job, I've just lost it, you are never, ever going to be able to relate to that average picture. And both of those analyses are true. The expert is right to say, here's an average picture on the best research we have, and the individual is entitled and a right to say, that is not my experience of it. And if experts don't reconcile that, it's not unreasonable for the public to reject the evidence they offer. So I think we need to do more to think about what are the questions the public are engaging with and get beyond that very high level view that expertise, so-called, is too often restricted to. But I think we also need to do something else. I said you cannot spend political capital you haven't earned. You cannot possibly parachute experts into the middle of a referendum campaign or an election campaign or any contentious debate with no pedigree, with no earned reputation to lean on. And yet that was what happened repeatedly during the referendum campaign to no obvious effect. Yesterday, and we will be announcing this publicly in the next few weeks, Full Fact and the Economic and Social Research Council and the UK Statistics Authority and the House of Commons Library announced that we are starting a project which we're calling the Need to Know Project, the purpose of which is to identify the public decisions that will be made over the coming years and to look at whether we have the data for those decisions, whether that data has been adequately analysed, and whether those conclusions have been clearly communicated so they are useful to the public and to other decision makers. And to do that before the issues are contentious, and to do that before we get into the middle of a campaign. And that is where I think the ballgame is. If there was an information deficit in this referendum, it was created in 2014 and not in May 2016. I think Hitan was absolutely right about that. The Need to Know project is an attempt to create the foundations of an informed public debate before people start trying to put buildings on top of them. And that, I think, is an enormously important thing. So I want to see more expert organisations building a reputation over time and building those foundations of informed debate rather than parachuting in and wondering why, in fact, people aren't willing to listen in those circumstances.
Well, thanks. You put that brilliantly, and a public service to remind everyone of Andy Haldane's actually work on this. I want to pick up two things really you've said as just a point for general discussion, because if you step back for a second, we've set ourselves this question of is the public had enough of experts, and we've ended up with what in a qualified way is quite a reassuring answer, at least at this point, that there are ways in which people reject facts, but we've ended up we've not signed on for the picture that we're dealing with the post-truth age at all. But what you've touched on is whether politics, and particularly economics, as it is presented at the moment, is particularly difficult to convey to people. Or as you said, there's absolute legitimacy of people saying, look, you've told me something that is good for the country overall. It might be free trade as well as say immigration, but that's not my experience, and so you've got an absolutely legitimate sort of rejection of it, and this is something difficult that is difficult about the political message. We live, to misquote the FT, in very economic times. Do you think, the rest of you, that there is something very difficult about communicating economic arguments to people, and that this is not, as you said, that they don't understand them, but it's not a good way of having this kind of argument, and this is part of what the referendum was about.
So Paul Johnson wrote quite a good piece in the Times reflecting on the role of economists, and a number of observations he made. One was that as a profession they hadn't done well. They hadn't been agile, they hadn't had leaders who were willing to step up and speak, so other than people like John Van Reenen at LSE, there were very few. But a kind of longer term issue was that economists had spent a lot of time talking about sort of, and this is not just in the referendum, but overall, talking about very detailed micro issues, but not building public understanding of really quite basic economic issues. So I think that's one of the real problems that he's identified.
I would agree with that, and to be honest, I would say it is the case that people on the whole don't understand economic concepts and economic. I mean, you know, I spent years working with Gordon Brown when he was Chancellor of the Exchequer, trying to sort of understand how he could, you know, best convey some of the things he wanted to convey to people. And it was very difficult at that point. For example, a lot of people thought that interest rates were a kind of tax. I mean, in fact, you know, we're doing some work at the moment on women in financial services, and which launches next week. And one of the things, something we've been doing with the FT, one of the things that we've discovered in this is that even, you know, and we were just doing work with women, so I don't know, to be honest, whether it's true of men or not, but I don't know. But we did a sample of women who were all quite sophisticated, running their own businesses, you know, often the main breadwinner in their household, certainly the people who were responsible for the household's family finances. And they were very competent at managing their family finances, but when we asked them about investments, most of them didn't know what a dividend was. They knew so little about investments that they didn't actually know what the concept meant. They didn't understand what it. And you know, so I think it's very hard. I think it's easy to underestimate just what the gap is between the expert and the public in this.
I was sort of probing at this question whether politics sort of is different from some of the other categories we'll talk about in a second, like medicine. Because of the nature of what it's trying to convey, but you've also got a background of, if you can put it, kind of times when people were told something by government and it hasn't worked out that way. We've had two big controversial wars, and obviously with the weapons of mass destruction issue embedded in one, and then the financial crisis. Do you feel that there's been a real change in how people sort of trust that kind of information?
I think that's right.
Because of that, or
I was going to particularly draw out the financial crisis, which wasn't a question of them being told something, it was more a question of them not being told something. You know, no one predicted it.
Yes.
It did have profound and long-term consequences. So when you have the same experts, the economists, the banks, saying this will be a disaster for the country, you know, it's the easiest and logical thing in the world if you're sitting in Peterborough or something. Well, they didn't get that right. Why do you think they're going to get this right? I mean, argue with that. You know, why are they wrong? You know,
quite.
You think it's a passing phase? I mean, but because we are only some years on from these, if you like, shocks to public trust.
Everything is ultimately a passing phase, but how long that passing phase takes is a different matter. And I think foreign policy and the wars, I think that goes to the question of trust in politicians more broadly. I think you have to separate out the trust in politicians and the trust in experts who aren't politicians, probably in this debate.
Yeah.
Okay, well then let's kind of test it by looking at areas that are not politics, and for example, medicine and health, and whether people trust their doctor, and they say, or whether they feel they should be able, in some sense, to do it themselves via Google.
I mean, that's fascinating. It's certainly not an area in which I'm an expert, but one of the things I think Deborah would tell us is that when you ask people who they trust, the stronger the connection between the person and the subject of a question, the more likely they are to trust. So classically, only a fifth of us trust trust MPs generally, but about half of us trust our local MP. Familiarity doesn't always breed contempt. And one of the things I think about I suspect that Deborah hears a lot from focus group participants is that politics is very remote. and there isn't much of a sense of connection there. And that is perhaps part of the problem. It's very easy to dismiss them as a very abstract category. But Honora O'Neill, in her Reflections on Trust, was, I think, brilliant on how we choose to place and refuse trust, and the fact that it requires repeated experience of people's undertakings and whether or not they live up to them. And that is, again, a reputation you earn over time. And perhaps one of the problems with the financial crisis for economists is we all know that reputation is much easier to lose than it is to gain. So the recovery in more than one sense might be slow.
Thanks. Heaton, do you feel that people's trust in facts from medicine and health, does it look the same as what we've been discussing about politics and economics, or is it?
Well, I think this is where, absolutely right that context matters a lot, but the polling figures I was giving earlier, where trust in doctors is sort of 80%, science is sort of in the high 70s, does show you're starting from a different platform. But on the other hand, when you get headlines saying, it's hard to know which week it is. Is it bacon cures cancer or bacon causes cancer week? So there is a trouble there in some kind of selected bits in the media where the evidence keeps seeming to change. But in general, I think there's much more trust for what your doctor tells you than there is for what your politician tells you.
But I don't think I agree with you about the proximity point, but I don't think it's just about that. In fact, I think that matters a lot less than people's assessment about whose side you're on and what it is that drives your behaviour. So, and if you're a politician, they assume that what is driving your behaviour is not their best interest. It's your best interest. If you're a bank, they assume that what's driving your behaviour is not their best interest, it's your best interest. Whereas, rightly or wrongly, I think that people do tend to assume that doctors are, there to serve the patient's best interest by and large. They may get it wrong sometimes, but they don't actually doubt their vested interests are elsewhere, I don't think.
I think that's a really interesting point, if I may jump in, because we worked a lot with academics and have for many years now trying to help them communicate their expertise in public debate. And one of the things we found fascinating as an organisation which is utterly paranoid about our reputation for being non-partisan is how difficult many academics find it to empathise with people with very different political opinions and communicate in a way that will be accepted as non-partisan and impartial by a very wide range of people. And that turns out to be a skill which is not always obvious to all academics. So even when they're doing their best to be fair, they're not always good at understanding what fair looks like to different groups of people. So I think that whose side are you? Can you
say a bit more about that? Because it's very interesting as we sort of try and think what we would like from this kind of communication.
Yeah. It's the subtext, it's the connotation all the time, isn't it? So are we talking about government spending? Are we talking about spending public money? Are we talking about spending taxpayers' money? Every single one of those says something very different and actually reflects very different political positions, attitudes, philosophies. A lot of people don't read that subtext and recognise that different people will react differently to it when they're trying at the same time to communicate very complex ideas as simply as they possibly can. So it's a constant minefield to navigate that kind of, subtle linguistic cues you're giving off that you might have a bias. But when you're being read in a hostile environment, in a very high temperature environment like a referendum campaign, lots of people will be looking for any clue of bias and then throwing it back in your face. And that, I think, is a process that academics aren't trained to navigate, and which is, quite a baptism of fire for a lot of people.
And I would just add, I don't think politicians have helped themselves at any point over the last 20 years in their use of facts and their use of statistics. They have, they've looked at them and willfully thought, how far can I twist this? How far can I push that? Started under Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, with the way in which they use money. We've got £10 billion more for this. Well, no, actually £8 billion you announced last week, and it took people a long time to come. And if you think back to 1997, no one thought about spin, but in a way this is where the whole idea of spin came from. We eventually cottoned on to what they were doing. And this is carried on, it's carried on with the Conservatives. It's just as true as opposition parties as it is of government. Look at NHS spending. There has been a marked failure of politicians across the board to be honest with the public about the NHS. You know, we'll cut your taxes and protect the NHS is a very good example. I think that was the sort of 2010 Tory slogan. It doesn't work. You know, either you have a separate NHS tax so that people can decide how much they want, or if you have it part of general taxation, you know, the two things are very, very interlinked.
Oliver's made this case before in his opening remarks that the media has got better at reporting these things, but has now thrown down this challenge, particularly about the Gordon Brown years. Deborah, is that your view?
That the media's got better?
Yes.
I think the media's got more irrelevant, actually. I mean, in terms of its
no
influence on public opinion, it's, you know, sorry, but I mean, you know that, don't you? You know, I think that, you know, people increasingly live in a sort of echo chamber of, and experts themselves are no different. That's why everybody thought Remain was going to win, because all the people they met at their dinner parties and so on thought that, so they thought it too. But actually the public do that as well. I mean, you know, social media in particular reinforces that. But just anywhere you hang out with people who think like you, it's confirmation bias. That's and actually where you do read media, watch, you know, you tune into the things that you agree with and tune out from the things that you don't.
It's less sort of media in general, more about, at least if you bought a whole newspaper, you've got a range of different views, whereas if you're getting all your stuff through Twitter, through your Facebook feed, you're getting the computer knows what you like the last time.
The algorithm, of course.
I think this is the irony. I think the mainstream media has got better in its use of presenting data and statistics. There's this whole thing called data journalism, which didn't exist before, and hopefully in a few years' time there won't be data journalism, it will just be called journalism. But, you know, mainstream media isn't consumed in the same way, so at the same time as it's got better, it's becoming more irrelevant.
There was a fantastic thing during one of sort of Jeremy Corbyn's travails, and which happened at the same time as the huge row about Cameron and his crony peers. And there was quite a bit of stuff from Corbyn supporters on Twitter saying, why isn't the media reporting the crisis with David Cameron's crony honours? It's like, well, hang on, we are. But I mean, yes, you're right, Deborah. The mainstream media perhaps is much less relevant than it was before.
No, it's not the media in the sense of mediating anymore. Let's come on to this question then of what policymakers should do about it. By policymakers, I mean it pretty widely. I mean, including, as we've been talking about science, or people who want to argue for, you know, a particular policy of way of organising things. But what we've described, as I said, is, you know, two parts reassuring, it seemed to be, in tone. On the other hand, as we've dug into a bit, these actual real problems in communicating some big chunks of what government, for a start, wants to do. So, Heaton, do you have any thoughts on that, or what, before we come to questions, on what, how policymakers might tackle the kind of things that we've thrown up?
Well, I suppose I alluded to a couple of things in my talk. One is about the statistics profession actually getting its house in order, so it becoming more anticipatory in what's going to be required, and it's great to hear about the new Full Fact project, which I think will help with that. And similarly with the Statistics Authority actually feeling empowered. I mean, one question was whether the PERDA period applied to the UK Statistics Authority or not. Now, it didn't seem to, but its interventions seem to kind of go lower. So that really needs to be clarified. We've just put in evidence to the PACAC, the Constitutional Committee, saying this really needs to be kind of laid out very clearly. So that's one area. I think the other thing which several of us have referred to is that the need for experts to kind of present themselves differently, as you said, build credibility, etc. And again, that is a long-term game. Once you're in the heat of an election or a referendum or a kind of policy question, it's too late.
Interesting. Deborah?
I mean, I think what I've kind of always thought on this, really, which is that policymakers and the public have to work together to get to a place, and that involves some kind of deliberative program where you know, the public are enabled to actually properly take part in the decision-making process, and during that, policymakers are forced to really get across where the public are as well, rather than, you know, see it and sort of sifted through, served up in a way that they find acceptable way.
And do you think that in some cases means actual more education? He
Well,
was
part of the
talking at the
process, I think
beginning
you
about
have
the
to.
difficult
Yes, it
about
has to be.
statistics and probability, and you've been talking about
but
financial.
I think it genuinely is education both ways around. I don't think this
Yeah.
is like a top-down here, you know, I'm grand policymaker, let me try to find a way of explaining to you my great thoughts. It has to come the other way as well. I think the gap between policymakers and public has never been greater, and it's only going to be healed by the two getting together properly.
I think at a political level, politicians need to say we support evidence-based policy making, and that's the top-line message. And then the policies that they put out, they need to publish the evidence base. And this won't be a quick process; it will be an extremely slow process. And there has been some move. One of the more encouraging things during the coalition government was this move by the civil service towards evidence-based policy making, particularly in education, with the setting up, I think it's the Education Endowment Foundational Fund, one or the other, which has just looked at all the various things you can do in schools and looked at the evidence to the extent to which they improve performance. And they've looked at international stuff, they weigh up the evidence, they say, well, there's a lot of evidence of this, but we haven't got a huge sample size, and they've done this across the board. I fear we're going backwards. Grammar schools is an absolute case in point. The evidence does not point to grammar schools being a sensible policy, and it was contrary to everything that was going on before, which is a massive shame.
I don't know how much we actually disagree, but I'm certainly not a fan of the term evidence-based policy. I think that policy making is inherently political and involves making choices of priorities and principles and risks based on uncertain information. That's what policy making really is. That's what politics really is. It's two people looking at the same facts and reaching different conclusions because of different principles and priorities. And we should never obscure that part of the political process. For all that, we should get the information as far as we can get the information. And if I were a senior policymaker in this day and age, I would be livid at the information I was expected to make decisions with, and the inability to link the impact of two different decisions on the same groups of people, for example, is fairly crippling if you're serious about running a country. And if you think about people running big businesses at the moment, the investment they are making in understanding the implications of what they do is massive. Government is beginning to get there. I think the leadership we're seeing in the civil service is definitely engaging with these issues, but I think we are a long way behind the curve, and we might as well be explicit about that and have that sense of urgency in filling in those gaps.
Thanks for that, and that's something we at the Institute are doing a lot on, and we're doing a lot more on what goes wrong in policy making, but also what you, as you very rightly put it, what you can reasonably expect, and how evidence that might be deployed in this. Thanks, a range of things, and I know when I go out of the room I will also have your passing comments about finance and about education in the back of my mind, because I'm always struck by the sheer complexity of the decisions that people have to make in their lives and their financial lives these days if they're going to live to 100 and have job visibility of a few years or whatever, and just to hope that some sense of trust in government is going to carry them through this very complicated conversation of the amounts of information they have to take in and the decisions they have to make. That seems like not enough of an answer. Let's go to questions. I think there are going to be quite a lot. Right, yes, great. And we've got a good lot of time as well. Good. I'm going to take them in pairs. Let's start here, and a gentleman on the aisle. Thank you. And we have a microphone. And is there another microphone? Great, thanks. So if you can come here on the aisle, thanks. And if people in the next door room, the innovation room, as we call it, want to stick their heads round, I think that old-fashioned technique is going to be the best.
My name's Ian Redford, I'm Deputy Chief Executive of the London Borough of Harrington. This is a little bit observation, a little bit question. I spent some time recently talking to some young black men.
Sorry, could you hold it nearer?
I've spent some time.
Can you hear it? No, all right, it's not on. Try again. Let's start from the beginning.
Hello? Is that working?
No.
No.
Shall I shout?
Yes. So you can stand up and shout. It doesn't do as much for the record, but at least people can hear you.
I'm Senior Etheridge. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of the London Borough of Haringey. That's looking more promising. Yes, it's got a light on it.
Tremendous.
And I spent some time recently talking to some young black men from Tottenham. They've all been involved in the criminal justice system to quite an extreme degree. Their lives work in such a way that they are both equally afraid of being on the streets after 6 o'clock at night because they're afraid of the police, and they're afraid of kind of other forms of violence that might befall them. Interestingly, without my raising it, the conversation turned to Brexit. They raised it. About a third of them had voted. One of them hadn't voted because he knew it was rigged to start with. And there were two really interesting observations that came out of that. The first was that they were absolutely convinced that the day after Brexit, which is the way they described it, the police had become more racist. It was an absolute fact for them that, you know, that the police were racist to start with, but the day after the vote, that was it. The police were infinitely more racist, and that was the way they experienced their lives, which is quite interesting. And the second is they said, it's all very well for you. You can study our lives as much as you want, but you will not understand them until you walk in our shoes, more or less verbatim. And I guess the challenge that this raises for us is kind of how you bridge that disconnect. Because actually, engaging with that group of young men who engage with lots of our public services and our wider policymakers, that's quite intense work. That's, you know, that's a lot of interaction to get trust up, to share values and things, and how you bridge that gap from kind of national government right down to kind of street level in Tottenham, I think is a real challenge for us. So I guess that was my question: is, you know, how do we start?
It's not a question, but do you have some suggestions yourself?
I mean, I would say this. I think local politicians are really important in this, because at their best, local politicians come from their communities and are infinitely connected into understanding their communities in ways that national politicians never are. And I think missing those politicians' connections with their communities is done at our peril.
Terrific. We'll get some comments on that.
John Newman, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right, splendid. On the EU referendum, we all know it was highly controversial, and so hence there was this great thirst for information. One consequence of that, I think, is we all suffer from information overload, and we got rather cross, particularly if what we received in terms of facts and information didn't perhaps quite match our prejudices. And I rather feel that that was the problem. I'd be more than interested if anybody can actually pinpoint the exact circumstances where Michael Gove made his remark, because I rather suspect it's when he and the vote leavers felt they might lose.
Interesting point, and embedded in there. Let me take another one for the range as well. On the aisle here, just straight back. We've got good time, so yes.
Hi, I'm Alan Cogbill. I used to be a senior civil servant. Nowadays, among other things, I'm a research associate at UCL Constitution Unit. I am somewhat despondent on the issue of governability, and I think this question about reconnection is rather critical. It's okay to say, well, what should experts, what should government, what should policymakers do? I guess I look at it in terms of, you know, have we got the population we need? Is actually the challenge, because it seems to me that there may be some questions about receptiveness to hard truth. I mean, the people who played well politically have tended to do things like Trump about saying, I'm right on your side, absolutely, and I share your anger, and it's them, demonized group. And that is, in a sense, self-defeating, because people who win by that technique are then going to disappoint their supporters, obviously. But it's very destructive, but it does work well. And Farage is believed, Johnson is believed. You know, people who say nasty things about demonized groups, that seems to go well. Now, we all duck out of personal responsibility. Every set of company results, you know, if they're good, company bosses are heroes, they want performance bonuses. If they're bad, trading conditions are generally adverse. You know, we're all guilty of that, I know. We don't like something about our lives. We want someone to take it away and sort it for us. But isn't that a deep psychological issue? And have people got any suggestions about how you make the political process cope with essentially psychological inadequacy about personal responsibility?
Gosh, a complex question, beginning from whether we have the population we need. I was wondering whether you suggest we get a different one, to how how these messages play into people's sense of responsibility. All right, multi-sided things about engagement, about Gove and prejudice, and about kind of a psychology of communication and populism. Who wants to chip in on any bit? It doesn't have to
make 2 points. One about Michael Gove. I went back and listened to those remarks. It's worth doing. I'm not sure he really meant it. I actually think it came out of his mouth and then he was picked up on it, and watch his face.
Yeah.
There was that sort of ouch, and then he tries to get out of it, and it's now been said as this was some sort of great deliberate thing. I'm not actually sure it was.
And also that rings true. From
on this point about have we got the people we want, it's not really answering your point, I'm afraid, but it's kind of interesting nonetheless. There's a great column in the New Yorker called The Financial Page, and the guy who writes it did something very interesting and talking about the rise of Trump and trying to explain the rise of Trump, and actually it goes to the EU referendum as well. There's a sort of behavioural insights which suggest if I said to you, I'll give you 50 quid, but we could also flick a coin, and if it's heads I'll give you nothing, but if it's tails I'll give you 100 quid. Most people, if you put that to them, will say, you know what, I'll take the £50. Do it the other way around and say, you owe me 50 quid, we'll flip the coin, if it's tails, blah blah blah, you give me 100. Most people will take the risk. This column made the point with Trump, their lives are pretty rubbish. They don't feel they've got much to lose. They're prepared to take the gamble. The same thing could be said. So actually it could be to do with, I mean, Deborah knows so much more about this than me, but I thought it was an interesting column.
Any more comments prompted by these?
Yeah,
go on, Deborah.
Well, actually, in a funny way, I think your point about have we got the electorate or the public that we want, and Zina's sort of, I mean, you're coming at it, it's the same thing, it's just she's coming at it in a more sympathetic place than you, but I think it is the same, you know, and I think in a way the answer is the same, which is that kind of relates to what I said earlier. You have to get those people doing the policy making. They have to, you know, you'll have a disconnect if you've got one lot of people saying here's what you need, and a lot of people saying no, it's not. And actually, they have to do it. And we have to find ways of making that happen, and I think that's the way. Can I just say one other thing about information overload? John's point. And facts not matching our prejudice and so on. And I think this is a real issue, because I think in the end your prejudice is always going to trump that fact. If I believe something to be true and somebody shows me a statistic, why would I believe them? You know, and I think that there's something we have to kind of get rid of, this idea of myth busting, and we have to work with what people think and find a way of making that the right thing.
Do you want to?
Yeah, I mean, just I agree that these sort of getting at similar kind of points, and in a way, there's all sorts of ideas we could come up with. How can we deal with the situation right now? But I think we do need some reflection on, are there underlying drivers? So I was pointing to this question about income gap, and you know, is there a really different story that we're seeing in the last decade to the one before? Is that going to be the case for the future? If we're seeing the kind of Uberization of the economy, et cetera, are we going to see more of that? So let's start thinking about how we tackle some of those underlying drivers which create the context for evidence, democracy, et cetera, as opposed to just trying to tinker with solutions for the kind of problem at hand.
I absolutely agree with Deborah about getting rid of this awful idea of myth busting, which is perhaps slightly surprising from a fact checker. But it's this dreadfully cleverer than thou attitude of the expert turns up, tells you what the right answer is and expects you to be grateful, that really needs to be put back in its box. It is incredibly important that we correct the record when we get things wrong. That journalists do it, the politicians do it, the experts do it, so that we avoid the spread of inaccurate claims through public debate. That's the epidemiology, if you like. But going to a random person and saying, you're wrong, be grateful, is an obviously stupid communications plan, and it really needs to stop. What we need to do is show serious respect for the public. And if you do that, the first thing you're going to think is the public, by and large, do not trust politicians and do not trust journalists. And they're probably rational. They probably have good reasons for not doing so. And the reason isn't that politicians lie all the time and journalists lie all of the time. The reason is that they have enough experiences of politicians and journalists saying things that are not trustworthy, and it is so difficult to discriminate between the trustworthy things and the untrustworthy things that it is a sensible strategy to say, I don't trust any of this. It's a perfectly sensible, rational reaction. So what we have to do is give people better choices than blind faith or blind cynicism. You have to give people the ability to judge things for themselves and make their own minds up. And that requires more effort on the part of the people on the powerful side of that conversation.
Just coming on the £350 million claim,
We had to end up there.
Is an interesting one. You know, it doesn't matter in some senses if that figure was wrong. And the more people sort of shouted and said, you've got that figure wrong, it isn't that. Actually, it's only 200 million or 125 million. People in their own minds knew that we were giving a lot of money to the EU. And the row about the 350 million really just sort of...
short-term money anyway. I mean,
yeah, exactly. Crystallised the fact that we were giving a lot of money to the EU. And actually, if the Remain campaign had any sense, they'd have shut up. Yes. And just not mentioned it, and it possibly, anyway.
It might. It's very, very hard to replay that one, but it's really what would happen. Very, very interesting. Let's take another three. Wow, multiply. Right here, over there, and then in the middle of the first. So
okay, hi, Tracy Brown, Sense About Science. I feel like I really want to burst a few bubbles here, because actually. What happened was that experts got marshalled in a political argument, and in some cases got marshalled and other people receded. I mean, if you read the accounts from inside the camps of the referendum debates, they were about how to marshal those experts, right? And the public called that out, rightly. It's why they're the best juries, it's why they're the best electorate, and we don't want experts to do either of those things. They called it out because they were absolutely right that that's what was going on. And I don't think that the ability of experts to get themselves across in public debate is entirely a presentational matter. I think there are experts who behave very differently in public debate. There are some who unfortunately get marshalled and they have to try and make themselves distinct from that, who are very open about the uncertainties and the discussion and what we've yet to find out and so on. And there are others who say things like, that's cancer in a glass, or they say things in public health terms that are all about getting you to behave a certain way because they think that you shouldn't eat donuts, because they have a moral position on that issue. And people call that stuff out. They rightly perceive it. Now, they may in the process dismiss the wrong bits, if you see what I mean. So it may be that I then blank you. 95% of my Facebook feed is actually Brexit. It's because it's peculiar for a number of reasons, but actually that's what was going on. People were saying, right, I can't listen to you because you've just stepped up in the place of a politician. They weren't able to unpick the bits that they might want to do for themselves. So I think, actually, contrary to the things that have been said about myth-busting, I mean, obviously the caricatured version you just gave, yeah, let's get rid of that if it happens. I think it might happen on Twitter or whatever. But the reality is that myth-busting is a very powerful tool in the hands of the public. And I think one of the things that experts should be doing is showing people how to ask those penetrating questions, how to ask those intelligent questions. One of the big things we've experienced as an improvement in journalism is getting journalists to ask better questions of the scientists, not to swallow whole the version of the better expert, because actually, for the reasons Oliver said, you can go down the wrong route with the most, with someone on the side of the angels. But actually, to get journalists to ask the questions, is it peer-reviewed? Has there been a systematic review? Things that get them to the bottom of stuff. And that's what our job is, to help the public ask the penetrating questions to fuel their desire to hold politicians and people in power to account. And that's what I think our challenge is, rather than to compete for their attention.
All right, terrific. Defence of myth-busting. Next. Thank you, Tracy.
Thank you. Adrian Brown from the Centre for Public Impact. I'm wondering whether we're having a conversation about, has the British public really had enough of experts, and maybe the United States public, because we've referenced the US election several times in this conversation. And my question is simply, is this a global phenomenon? Are we seeing, because social media and the other trends that have been mentioned, this is something all countries are going to have to deal with? Or is it perhaps that the two countries we're particularly focused on, the UK and the US, have very adversarial political systems that demand an I'm right, you're wrong kind of debate, and it shapes the media debate and it shapes the public debate into a sort of let's herd the experts onto one side or herd the experts on the other side. Have the Swedish public had enough of experts? I'm not so sure that they have.
Thank you. Very provocative. And one more.
Carl Allen, I'm a member of the public. I'm actually a pensioner. My question as a member of the public. So should I expect for the foreseeable future that when experts speak, if they speak for 15 minutes, 10 minutes of that should be education and 5 minutes of that should be they are talking on whatever they are presenting? Should that be the way to go for the foreseeable future? Or should we focus on giving that sort of education in schools?
Thank you very much indeed. Back to very resonant way, back to the education question. What responsibility experts have for giving things. Do you want to start? Let's go this way.
Quickly jump in on what Tracy said. I don't think we disagree on a word of it. If it wasn't clear from my use of the Martin Lewis example, he is credibly on the side of the public and helping them make up their own minds. That's the crucial point. Everything else he does flows from where he starts from and what he is trying to achieve. So it's not just a presentational issue, not for a second.
Any other? On the education point, or?
On the education point, I mean, I think you make a really good point. And in a way, you have to do both, don't you? But if the education system improves so that, for example, people understand better how the economy works or whatever, it's going to take a long time for that to feed through into the public as a whole. So it's going to be the case, I think, for quite a long time that experts need to educate if they want their message to be heard.
Yeah, I mean, I agree totally with Deborah and your point. I think someone needs to have a real look at the education system and think, what do we want? Yeah, sorry, horrible phrase, the citizens of tomorrow to know. I did economics at A-level more by chance than design. I thought it sounded kind of interesting. And it was the most useful thing for everything I've done since. There's so many different things that, you know, elastic supply and demand, ways of seeing the world that I learnt through doing that. And I've always wondered, just on a personal level, why this was something you could just choose to do. And it wasn't something that actually everyone had to have some knowledge of, because way in which it, you know, impacts upon the way in which you see the world.
Thanks. And let me say something on the question then about whether, you know, the world is getting fed up with experts. It seems to be, you can say in many countries, in the West broadly, if you want to use that phrase, that we live in much less deferential times. People are much more kind of robust about whether or not they take the views of all kinds of institutions. I think you're right about the adversarial system but it's not just the political system in Britain and America. I mean, it's the way, particularly in America, I spend quite a bit of time, you find people living in entirely red or blue, Republican or Democrat worlds, associating with the people who agree with them, watching only those media, obviously, as we're discussing, drawing on those social media. So there is a sort of polarizing capability built into the world at the moment.
It's also the kind of world-weary cynicism, I think, that's really a characteristic of those sorts of developed economies. That I've just been doing some work in India.
But it's not just cynicism. Some of it is made possible by huge benefits like media and social media and interconnection and globalization that people don't have to.
Sure, but I've just been doing some work in India where there is social media and all of those things. But actually one thing that struck me with a series of workshops I was running there was just how incredibly untainted people's views were, so how willing they were to accept things that, in this instance, the company we were doing work for, you know, was testing messages, and you know, I just knew if I tested those messages in the UK or the US, people would have been, you know, rolling around the floor laughing and kind of. But actually, they were really prepared to take these on board and very kind of. I found it was really interesting, and when they talked about politics and talked about other things as well, they did it. I felt in a very different way.
Yeah, well, I don't want to generalise too far. Then I can take exactly that kind of point, but I think, I mean, you know, there is a sense in which this goes beyond, you know, episodes of mistrust and is about how people treat institutions generally. Sorry, Heaton, you want to say something?
Tracy's point, which I think absolutely right. How do we build a social movement for evidence, as it were? I know it's something Sense About Science is really interested in, but just to give a particular example, where recently the Department for Health did some really good research on alcohol and its impact on, all of us. But then the guidance that they issued was of the sort that Tracy was talking about, which says you should or should not do this. And we had to call them out on this. First time the Royal Statistical Society has appeared in the Sun and the Mail on the same day. But I mean, it took alcohol to do that. But I mean, that's just an example of this happens all the time.
Let's take 3 more. Here, and then on the aisle, and then right over here. And then I'm coming to the back at the end, so you won't be forgotten. Sorry, yes, you first.
Hi.
Yes.
Jennifer Rubin, I'm Professor of Public Policy at the Policy Institute at King's College London. And just to go back to drawing together a couple of the points that people have raised, but also to raise a new one. I don't think anyone's talked about inequality yet. And I think there's an important point to be made about, well, first of all, I think trust in experts is partly about, well, having had enough of experts is partly about trust, and trust is partly about empathy. And empathy is partly about believing that people can see your perspective and are actually out to help you as well as themselves. And I think, to Adrian's point about is losing confidence in experts the same across countries, and I don't think it is the same, but nor do I think the widening inequality is the same across countries. And I think if you've got people, for example, listening to George Osborne, putting Jamie Dimon up in front of them and saying, right, Brexit would mean job losses. Look, Jamie Dimon, the chief executive of an investment bank, says that we'll lose investment banking jobs. I'm not sure why people in unemployed communities where they've lost their steelworks are going to care too much about those investment bankers losing their jobs. And I don't think that helps build the trust and the confidence that the politicians have some empathy with what their life and their situation is. So it seems to me that, that's one set of questions. It's about how you get policymakers and politicians to think more about how they're going to engage more proactively with those communities, both to change the actual material circumstances that might be driving some of their mistrust and alienation, but also to actually use examples, to address them in terms that they might actually find persuasive. That's one. The other is just a point about the primacy of economics in some of these arguments. So there are different kinds of expertise, and I must confess to harboring a bit of economic training in my own background, so this is not any kind of particular slur, but a lot of the referendum campaign was framed in terms of, will we be £10 better off because of this or £5 worse off because of that? And actually a lot of it was much more about culture, psychology, hearts and minds, the corner shop. And that wasn't about whether the corner shop was going to succeed or fail in financial terms. It was about whether they were going to be able to get a pasty as well as a naan bread. So it's...
Thanks for making those points. That's tremendous. Thank you.
Okay, my name's Steve Weiler. I'm a Carnegie associate, and I've worked in the field of community development for many years. And what I've seen there is that the experts, the often cleverer than thou experts who know what's best for communities, are the academics and the town hall planners and housing officers and regeneration specialists and sometimes politicians and so on. And they're the people that control the decision making by and large and control resources. And their expertise is often very limited. And my experience has been that a great deal of expertise, perhaps the most important expertise, is found among residents of the housing estates and the neighbourhoods and the poor communities, and they're not regarded as experts, and they don't have access to decision making and control of resources. And so my question really is to the panel is, who are the experts?
Great point, thank you. And over here on the edge.
Duncan Ross, Director of Data at Times Higher Education and Trustee of DataKind UK, and probably an expert in something. I think I want to, apologies, it's mostly a comment rather than a question. Every single one of the panelists and many of us in the audience have talked about the public as if it is a monolithic thing. It is not a monolithic thing. We should think about how we would group and cluster that. And I think what we're starting to see from some of the evidence, if you look at the Ashcroft polling after the election, after the Brexit vote, is that, and if you look at what's happening in the US, is that there seems to be at least two distinct groups. One group, which we're probably all members of, who frankly trust experts, whether they're politicians, whether they're economists, whether they're journalists. We may disagree with some individual ones, but broadly speaking, as a group, we trust them. But there's another group of people who fundamentally don't. They're almost anti-fact. If you present a fact to them, that is evidence that you're wrong, regardless of what the fact is. And my favorite way of discerning which group people are in is mention of the mainstream media. Pretty much as soon as someone mentions the mainstream media, in quotes, you know which side of that argument they're on. My plea as a data scientist, not a statistician here, is to think about clustering and about subgroups rather than thinking of the public as a monolithic grouping.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Thoughts on that?
I thought I was going to agree with you massively. My head was nodding so much it almost fell off when you talked about the public not being a monolithic lump. And then I sort of fell out with you when you said everybody in this room trusts experts. I just don't think that's true. I mean, I think... okay, whatever. I mean, I think the answer is that we all, and I agree with you about how we should segment the public and so on, but all that. But I mean, actually, I think we all have a tendency to only agree with experts if they broadly say what we already think, and we all have massive difficulty if they challenge something that we think. I don't think that anybody in this room or any member of the public, whatever segment they fall into, will be very different from that.
Any other points?
I mean, I think on the point about inequalities, I do think that's something that May has identified. It was there in her speech. She clearly feels very strongly about it. It's there in the grammar school. She's quite specific about who she wants to help. She's talking about those people, I think, earning between £19,000 and £28,000. Not people below that, because she feels they're already being helped by the system as it is. But it's other politicians have tried to do this as well. It's alarm clock Britain, that horrible phrase, and another one. But she's been quite specific about that being the group that she wants to get at. Whether she succeeds or not, I don't know. But it's quite interesting. And there's a story this morning about a company that was supposed to identify fraud and error in the tax system that's just been basically told you're not going to get the contract from next May. Now, my understanding is that it was Downing Street that stepped in to cancel the contract. And because this fraud and error, the people they're going after are the people in May's constituency. And I think we may see quite a big fundamental change in the way in which government operates in that area.
Yeah, really interesting. The people shifting in their seat and muttering. Does anyone want to come back really quickly on any of that? No. Let's go on. There's a lot of people. You've still got one?
Yeah, Colin from NCDO.
Right, and then right at the back, someone has been incredibly patient. Thank you. And not bad time. I'm going to actually take 4 in this round, just so that we try. Go on.
You've talked about politicians and journalists as experts that the public don't trust. Do you think people trust experts in charities when they come on and talk about issues?
Very good question. Thank you. Speaking from a charity. Right at the back.
Ben Alexander. Recently, I've noticed there seems to be quite a tendency to describe evidence as scientific, when it could actually more properly be described as statistical. Amongst other things, it makes me worry that the person actually issuing the so-called evidence actually thinks it's a hard fact, when in fact what they're actually doing is producing some sort of central value out of a distribution. And I'm wondering, do people think actually this is something that people aren't really bothered about, sort of to pick up on Deborah's point, which is people are kind of moving away from data if it doesn't agree with them, or to pick up on Will's point, do we need to make more of an effort to indulge people in the fact that there is a distribution out there, and we understand that you are going to be on different parts of that distribution?
Great question, thank you. A lot packed in it. Here in the front, trying to do it roughly in the order in which people have stuck their hands up.
Thanks. Stefan Stern. Just from a practical point of view, what do you think the Remain camp could or should have done about both the 350 million number and the other poster that said Turkey is joining the EU? I won't use the L word, but these were both, I think, wildly extravagant and inaccurate claims. I don't think they were facts. So what do you do when you're dealing with that sort of message?
Let's take those quick answers to or responses to these 3, and I'm going to try and squeeze a few more in as well. but panellists have to leave on time.
On experts in charities, Tim Harford's done this great work around statistical bullshit, and some of the work we've done as well and others shows that charities are actually really bad at using data and statistics. They're often campaigning for a cause and will just assemble the evidence to push for what they want. So I think we are seeing a kind of growth in mistrust in charities, although that's for perhaps other reasons.
And the interesting point about statistics versus science and...
yeah, I mean... on that, I think you're quite right, and at quite a high level, one of the things we're finding is there's this whole issue of reproducibility of science. You know, so that if you go and redo a lot of the studies that were done before, they don't stack up. So I think there's actually a crisis of science coming. So your point about it's statistical, not scientific, is very important.
Yeah, and on what the Remain should have done.
Thankfully, that's not my problem. I do sort of think it was, in a sense, too late. We didn't have the institutions in place that were able to respond authoritatively and quickly at that point to correct it and to cut it out, and the broadcasters wouldn't have been ready to take that cue if it happened. But when you've got somebody sitting on Question Time saying, if you look at table 9.9 of the Pink Book, you'll find the 350 million figure, you kind of lost the battle when you published the Pink Book the year before. That's what the Need to Know project is about. It's anticipating what use information is going to be put to and making sure that it's actually clear for those users.
Great, let's try and just squeeze in a few more comments and then it will be last thoughts. I'm sorry, and yes, them, and then the other side over by the window. I'm incredibly sorry, but you were not the first. I'm going to come here. I simply have to give.
Okay.
I was squeezing one more, but people make their comments.
Bruce Lloyd, isn't essentially the problem with experts, it's a paradox, and essentially experts are people who know a lot about something but are free from vested interests. But by and large, they are used by people who have vested interests. And I wonder whether one of the jobs that Will has or should have is to expose these vested interests. And the thing about Martin Lewis is it's generally assumed he doesn't have a vested interest, and that's one reason why he's credible and successful. Okay. But just very quickly related to that is the extent to which Will is also looking at the language that we use to talk about these issues. Two words I would ban, absolutely and could, both of which are used all the time and essentially are distracting, if not meaningless.
Thank you very much. Great point.
Hello, yes. Lucy Rycroft-Smith, Cambridge Mathematics, Cambridge University. So I would say this, but I think the point about education is key. And particularly having been a mathematics teacher myself, and some of the work that we're doing centres on curriculum changes. So I'd be interested to hear what the panel think, as Deborah brought up, about actually improving the public understanding of statistics, financial education, economic education, through educational policy change, curriculum change.
Terrific. So another one, and I will come to you. Yeah.
Parliamentary and Health Service Ombudsman, and we deal with the lack of public trust every day, where people make complaints about public services, and actually what we do is we give them voice and power in relation to the state where we uphold complaints. So I've got a long-term interest in the issue, and I actually just wanted to reinforce what Deborah said and then will reinforce, which is actually solving the conundrums we've been talking about this morning. I think does come about through education both ways, through some form of deliberation. I've been lucky enough to commission a number of citizens' juries, and what I love at the end is the way individuals who are taking part feel privileged to have access to facts, to education and opinions, and then deliberate and come to their own conclusions, particularly where there are trade-offs between competing objectives. But then the politicians who listen feel privileged to understand the values and motivations behind the conclusions that people have come to, and so I just wanted to reinforce I think that is part of the solution.
Thank you very much indeed. And final one, gentleman on the door.
Trevor Lanwarn. I'm speaking as someone who for 6 or 7 years was treated as an expert in government, and I'm not sure you've heard that view yet, although I know that there's at least one other person in the room who can say the same thing. My first question is in relation to how do you get policy advisors to get better use of experts? And I think your starting point has to be what exists at the moment, which is every government has a chief scientific advisor. There are various roles like the chief vet. I was government actuary, but there's a national statistician. So my question is, to what extent does the existence of those people who will not want to go public because they lose influence as soon as they say too much in public, they've got to be behind the scenes. So to what extent do your recommendations on how to improve things build on the existence of that structure that exists? The second thing is, given that that's available to government and it's not available to opposition, how do you put the non-government part into a similar position so they're just as good in terms of what's behind the scenes?
Trevor, there's a great, I would personally love a longer conversation on that than we've really sadly got time for. Do people want to give their last thoughts? But those are terrific points about how government actually does this at the end. Let's go from the side. Will.
An intimidating pitch to end on. On the subject of national statistician, he is the one who is backing the Need to Know project from the UK Statistics Authority side. The other, well, one of the other three partners in there is the House of Commons Library, which is in part the answer to the question of how do we support the opposition in having access to the analysis and information that it needs. And it's a crucial institution, I think, for that role. I would just like to reinforce the point I made about Andy Haldane's speech, which if I could assign as homework, I would. People have talked about inequality, people have talked about needing to understand the different parts of the public, people have talked about needed to understand the marginal effect of policy and not just the average effect of policy. That's what Andy is arguing, if I can first name him. He's saying that our analysis is not supporting us in doing that because we're talking at too general a level and we need to drill down and understand what's really going on. I think that's a really fundamental point to take away, and that will bring expertise closer to the public.
Thank you.
I just make one very simple point on your issue about opposition in government. Oddly, I think that it's often the opposition parties that get a better understanding of the issues than it is in government, because they've got more chance to speak to them outside the pressures. They haven't got the civil service, etc., and some of the more internal expert advice. But that's just an argument.
A sweeping one. Oh, we've got rid of several thousand people's jobs. Hitan.
Quickly on deliberation, I absolutely agree. I think it's really important. I think the challenge is how do you scale that up? So citizens' jury is all very well, that kind of local level, small project. We haven't yet found the way, but there must be a way of doing it. On education, obviously, I agree. It was something I was talking about earlier, but it seems to me one thing that we should really build on is core mathematics. So this is a new thing for the 80% of students post-16 who don't take A-level maths and used to just drop maths. But so this is using maths and statistics, but it's been a bit of a damp squib so far. So government really needs to back it, universities and employers.
I'm sorry I haven't got the chance to say what I think Remain ought to have done, but I can't make that my last thought. So the last thought has to be, the point about the public as expert and so on, and for me the only way forward is to have the public and policymakers working closely together, collaborating and co-creating, and I think that really is a win-win, because it's not just that the policymaker will get a better insight into the public, but actually the public get a better insight into the challenges that policymakers face as well. And of course you can scale it up. You know, we live in the world of the internet, and of course we can scale it up, but I'm not always sure you need to. I mean, I think that we might well, just as we trust a legal jury, we trust 12 people to take a decision, a big decision on our behalf, I think we might do the same with policy too.
Interesting. We've begun with reassurance. We've dug into that and unpicked some of it. We've come right at the end to some of the things that, like education and government advisors, that actually could take a whole session in themselves. And I'm really sorry. Thanks for raising them. They're terrific points and questions. I'm sorry we can't right now dig into them in more detail. Thank you for coming, being a fantastic audience and fielding, putting up such very good questions. Thank you again to the Royal Statistical Society and Carnegie UK Trust for joining us on this. Can I just flag up 2 bits of IFG work? One tomorrow, which has some data on and findings on public trust. Again, reassuring with some stings, and a much fuller picture with a lot of polling on Monday, which sketches out that picture, particularly with some concerns to me on people's trust in MPs at the local level. Thank you all, and thank you to our panel.